Welcome, everyone, and an especially warm welcome to those of you who are coming to an alignment session for the very first time. We're so glad you're here. We are here monthly to hear from our wonderful authors, and also weekly we have a session on Sundays of contemplative practices, of prayers from a different tradition each week. You're welcome to anything and everything at all times. So glad to have you all with us here, and especially to have Hila here leading us tonight. I first came to know her work through Ritual Well and the beautiful resources there, but have been enjoying this treasure of poems, There Are Still Woods, and especially in rereading these poems over the past couple of weeks. These past couple of weeks, it's proven to be a place of solace, of shared lament, of ongoing challenge and inspiration in the recognizing the fragility of the world and of us as a part of the world. So I'm so deeply grateful for your work, Hila, and for joining us and leading us tonight in this session. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Margaret. It's really an honor to be here and just to get to know this community. And I watched some of the videos of previous talks, and it's such a warm and welcoming space. And really appreciate that it's an interfaith space and people coming from all different backgrounds. I think it's so important, especially these days, for people to connect across all cultures and faiths, and just areas where we can really hold each other in what we share in common. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a bit about the process of writing this book, in addition to reading poems from the book. And I'm also going to offer a couple of writing prompts along the way. But feel free, if you've got your notebook and your pen, to just have it ready, because anything along the way might spark something for you. So if there is an image or a phrase or an idea that kind of sticks with you, please, feel free to just stop and kind of jot something down and let that be your writing prompt too, because the official prompts might not be the ones that you want or need at this moment. So take everything as possible fodder. Um, and yeah, so just a little bit about myself. I live in the Chicago area now. I did used to live in Philadelphia, and that's when I worked at Ritual Well, which was at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Um, and actually, many poems in the book were written in Philadelphia while I lived there, and then in a number of other locations where I did some writing residencies. Um, so a little bit of the story behind There Are Still Woods. I've been writing for a very long time. I got my MFA back in 2007, and I'm somebody who often goes through periods of not writing for different amounts of time every time that happens. And I don't tend to, as Margaret and I were talking about before, I don't tend to sit down and just write because I feel like I'm supposed to, or because I'm a poet or I'm a writer. I really just kind of wait for the moment. And so I was going through a period of time, this was sort of leading up to 2012 or so, where I just wasn't inspired and nothing, I didn't want to write much poetry. But there's always a sense, like, oh, I probably should be writing poems, but nothing was happening. And it was actually Hurricane Sandy that was what sort of jostled me out of that rut, I guess. So I was living in Philadelphia when it happened, and we were ultimately safe and fine, but it was scary. It was a huge event, and I'm also from Queens, New York. And my parents still live there, and they were fine in the end, but the block next to them, trees came down, and watching the news afterwards and seeing the destruction of a place that was my home, just so close to me. Um, it really kind of reoriented me toward, oh my God, like we're seeing climate change happen in real time. And I think I was already very aware of it, but it was still something that felt like it was more abstract and more kind of like, oh, it's gonna, one day, but I don't think collectively we were all calling it a crisis at that point. And so it started to just kind of come back into the foreground for me. And along the way, I started to consciously decide to start focusing on climate change. So I was reading books, I was reading a lot of nonfiction books and articles. And it turned out I had a friend who was also kind of in this mode, and we started a climate change book club in Philadelphia. So we would get together and read. We read Joanna Macy, Bill McKibben, Elizabeth Colbert, and we would just get together and discuss these books. And that was really amazing, looking back and thinking that I had a space like that to both learn and process that information because it's not the kind of information that we really want to look at often. And so it's much easier to just kind of, ignore it. Or you might know sort of about it, but you might not want to read all the gory details of it. But I really wanted to understand climate change and something that I had understood in the abstract. I started to really educate myself more. And at the same time, I started writing poems in response to a lot of the things that I was reading. And, and I wasn't conscious of this at the time, but looking back, writing poems in response to what I was learning was really a way of helping me to digest this information and to respond to it and to respond to it creatively. And along, sort of the years of writing the book, I started to see, visual art and other forms of response to climate change. And all of it really helped me to find that space where like I could face this very difficult information, which is really hard to do if you don't have some kind of a container or some kind of a creative practice where you can do that. So it just turned out that that was very helpful for me. And it wasn't really something I realized I was doing at the time. It just sort of unfolded that way. Um, and even looking back today, because this was, I wrote these poems from probably 2012 through, you know, even up to like 2018 or so. Um, Today, I realize that as I'm still witnessing, the effects of climate change and the worsening effects, I don't react to it in the same way than I think I would if I hadn't had that sort of intensive period of time where I was really engaged with the information and really allowed myself to fully accept and witness the reality of what was happening. So as much as it's very disturbing and it's not, I'm not like okay with what is happening, I also like have psychologically processed it. And I think having the space of poetry to do that, and it will continue to be that, was really helpful for me. Um, so I also want to talk a little bit about then where did the spiritual side of this come from, which is also something interesting because it was only after I finished writing the book that looking back, I started to notice all the spiritual things and the God things and the Jewish references that I didn't think were as prominent as I see now, looking back at the book and thinking, oh no, there's like a lot of that stuff in the book. Um, and I've always just been somebody who, since from a young age, I loved nature and I was always associating nature with something that felt spiritual. And it was always a question. I was from a young age wanting answers about God and the universe. And so probably since I was a kid and through, early college, I was really on a very intensive search to find, the right answer and the right path. And, but it was always coming from a place of awe and wonder and wanting to make sense of what I was, experiencing in the world. So God just naturally comes out in my poems. And so I will read one poem that that starts to illustrate this. So this is called Google Earth. Airplane wings dip into clouds, piled up like mountains. Earth cut in rectangles of green and scorched brown. Water apportioned below, snaking through golf courses into swimming pools. Trees huddled together in squares. On the ground, roofs keep us from looking up. One day, there will be no rain. One day, we'll be able to Google Earth from somewhere else. We will see pictures of Everglades, alligators, frogs. We will part the clouds with our hands, look down at all that wildness sectioned off. We will reach our arms to the bottom of the sea and pull out the stringy-haired gods. They will blink green eyes as the salt water drips from their algaed heads. They will shake their faces as the earth trembles, looking at us for the first time. And so, this poem kind of goes through a process of just witnessing, the effects of climate change and thinking through them. But then suddenly, and it's always a surprise that something comes up like that in the poem. But suddenly, through this image of sort of looking at the world from above, I just had this image of pulling out the gods from under the ocean, right? That just popped up. Um, and and there's something interesting about how they kind of look back at us. There's a reckoning that happens there where we sort of re-encounter the ancient gods of our civilization, and but they kind of look back at us and say, like, what are you doing about this? Right. And so that I think that's sort of like a theme that comes up a lot in the book is sort of the God figures and the spirit figures are really challenging us to say, hey, how did we get here? What are we doing? Um, and so, and then of course, like there are so many different God characters that I encountered along the way. I mean, I'll talk a little bit later of just more the sort of traditional God from Judaism that I grew up with, but then there's also um, I accidentally came across Sedna, who is a character in Inuit mythology. I don't know if anybody has already heard of her before. There's a couple of other poets who have written some cool Sedna poems as well. And I came across Sedna very much by accident while I was just kind of reading all these different science articles. And there was one about how there was this object in space that was named after Sedna. And then I just went down the rabbit hole and started reading everything about her, in addition to many other Inuit folk tales. And I just kind of had these beautiful sources to just kind of like, you know, um, they just kind of lived with me alongside all these science articles that I was reading. And the story of Sedna just really spoke to me as, I mean, it wasn't about climate change, but it started to speak to me in that way. And the myth of Sedna is that she is a woman who is betrothed to be married to somebody that her father requires her to marry. Of course, she doesn't want to. And it turns out that the man that she ends up marrying is in disguise, and it's actually the character of Raven. And he takes her away and brings her to a cliff, and she's very unhappy. And her father tries to save her, but then she and her father are both running away from Raven. He chases them and they go off into a kayak into the sea, and Raven sends a spirit to cause a storm that throws them overboard or throws her overboard. And she clings onto the side of the kayak, but her father is just trying to save himself from the scary spirit. So he ends up chopping off her fingers. And not a happy story. But then what happens is she sinks to the bottom of the ocean and she becomes the goddess of the sea. And her fingers that are dismembered become whales, walruses, and all of the sea creatures. And so this is the origin of the sea creatures. And then she becomes a figure that one of the most important kind of goddess figures in Inuit mythology that the shamans have to appease her. in order to if there's no animals to hunt, it's because Sedna is mad. And so in order to appease her, the shamans have to go on this mystical journey under the sea, and they have to do things like comb her hair because she has all these crabs and shells stuck in her hair. And because she doesn't have her fingers to comb her own hair. So there's all these amazing different versions of the myth, and I just kind of was entranced by it, but it also felt like, wow, she seems like when we see the earth respond to us in when we when you break taboo is when the shamans have to go and appease her, but we are doing that through climate change. And so I felt that Sedna became this voice of responding to climate change and saying, hey, like, if you keep doing this, I'm going to keep making hurricanes, and I'm going to keep doing, these are the consequences. So there are two Sedna poems in the book. There were many others that like didn't even make it into the book. Um, I'll just read one of them. This is okay. Sedna, the Arctic sea goddess. The men fashioned their bitch goddess into a fat girl, daughter of Anguta, creator god, angry dad. In every legend, your father throws you to sea. You cling to the kayak. He cuts off your fingers. You drown. Your fingers become seals, walruses, whales, creature fingers sprung from sea blood. You leash your seals, hold back fish in your silky palm, till the hunters hunger so much they send shamans to wash and comb your hair. Only a man's goddess would lose use of her hands. Only a man's goddess would withhold food in exchange for praise. No wonder you rage at the bottom of the sea. No wonder you explode with hurricanes when man's heat sends you to a frenzy and you shake your stump of a fist at dry land. Um, so I thought I would offer a little prompt here. If, I don't know if you all can think of a character, and it could be a character. Thank you for the comment. I just saw one comment pop up. Um, it could be a character from mythology, from any tradition that you may have access to. It could be a character from film or from literature. It could be a superhero or an animal or a god, but to give space, and it could be that character is the speaker, if that speaks to you, or the character is incorporated in some way. I did have some other poems where Senna actually speaks, and they just are not in the book. But yeah, so I'll give you, 5 minutes to do a little scribbling. So just let that character speak, and and it doesn't have to be about the environment. It could be about something else that you maybe, it that might help you to express something that in your own voice may not be as accessible. So thinking through this other character's voice. And I'll start a timer for 5 minutes. Okay, my timer has gone off. Please feel free to continue finishing what you're writing right now. And then, of course, this is just the beginning of something that you can keep working on later. Um, and I'm going to keep going. So I wanted to transition now into the other god in the book, which is sort of the more traditional god that I grew up with. I had a very intensive Jewish education growing up. I went to Jewish day school, conservative, and even though we weren't very observant, we were still very Jewishly active in my family. So we did a lot of synagogue and Friday nights and holidays and everything. Um, And I just happened to be one of these kids who was really interested in God and had all these questions and really wanted to know if God was real and all the things. And of course, along the way on that journey, probably by the end of college, I came out the other end after an intensive time studying. I studied a lot of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. I had the language and the textual skills to be able to do that, although I think it was way over my head, but I was able to study these things. Um, but by the end of it, I think, toward the end of college, I came back out, with more questions and with less certainty than I went in. I think I was very anxious to find answers and then evolved to the point where I was okay with actually just having a very almost existentialist view of God, and that God is really just an experience, and that, all the things that we might say or describe God as are not real, but are just words and images that we use. Um, and I've kind of stayed like that. I think I've stayed just very kind of open to what it might mean. And I don't know what I can say about what is real or not in terms of God, but I do feel that it is an experiential reality. And so I think this comes out in some of the poems. So one of them I'm going to read here is, go. I kind of memorized where everything is in the book. Here it is, because I've read this so many times. This one is called In the Field I Have Chosen. Rustling sound of God's bare feet in the grass as the earth prepares to birth itself again. I thought there was something I was supposed to do to make that happen. The hawk only stayed an instant, while the rest of the birds kept ticking. It turns out I don't have to do anything. The lake lives for its ripples. The wind licks the mirror. God is a placeholder for God, holding this place, Makom Ha'olam, where the branches parted, where the hawk turned back to the business of sifting wind. So Makom Ha'olam is the place of the world, and Makom is one of the many words for God in Jewish tradition. And so, there's this idea that God is the place of the world, um, but there is no place where God isn't. There's just all this playing with that idea of God and place. Um, but, and of course, again, like these things all come out as a discovery in the poem. So I didn't know I was going to say God is a placeholder for God, but then every time I look back at that, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I believe. If you were to ask me, what do I believe about God or what do I think about God, is that there's no knowing of God. There's only this constant pointing toward, which is also kind of a Buddhist idea, this image of the pointing to the moon. Um, and and I'm very happy with this, actually, this existentialist sort of uncertain place. I actually prefer that to the place of certainty. Um, and I will say I'm married to an atheist, which is really fun for somebody who's sort of this weird religious existentialist. And my husband, who's an atheist scientist, will say, we can't know whether God exists. And if God does exist, it doesn't matter because we can't know God. So he has this like kind of similar, but coming from another place. So he's just like, I just don't need God. And yet, it's interesting that there are certain people who still have this need for it, and I think it's a way of looking at the world and at a certain mindset where we're looking for that, whatever that thing is, or we have this intuitive sense that there's a something there, or there's a something that's behind nature, or um that's the engine of our reality. And so I still have that, and I still very much feel that in nature specifically. And so I just don't need it to be, one thing. So there's another poem that kind of goes into that a little bit. Uh, Here. The names of God. When do you get to think about God? When the child's nose is dripping onto your breast, and you've sunk into the rhythm of your own voice, humming a song you can't remember, where you first heard. At the end of a 12-hour day of this, rocking back and forth, with a pinched sciatic nerve, as the child snorts and rubs his face on your skin, and you both surrender, staring at the twilight out the window, the glowing blue promise of dark, when you sink into the physical moment of holding, rocking, somehow being rocked, and you try to remember why you started writing in the first place, how you used to sift through the names of God, trying to find the one maybe even you could pronounce. As the child moans, one long syllable, there is no time now to think about God. And anyway, you have accidentally made a prayer of your two bodies by the darkening window. So there's this idea, that the name of God in Judaism is unpronounceable. And so that's where this comes from, that there might be a name of God that one could pronounce. But then of course it just kind of becomes the sound of the child, the sort of inarticulate, syllable of the child, kind of becomes that name. Um, I'll read another one here that goes into this is called Of the Veritable Ocean, and it riffs a little bit on one of the prayers of the High Holiday liturgy. So for those who know that prayer, you'll hear it, you'll recognize it, and I'll explain it afterwards. Of the Veritable Ocean. I trace the jagged residue with my feet. The sand presses grains to skin, and I press back so the sand feels wanted. Waves fall like the word what. What is happening to me? And how will all my creatures go? Who by oil? Who by bomb? Who by storm? Who by dry land? By famine? Who by what? What? Water. I feel the people wade and wallow into my open throat. I cough a question and swallow it back. Which one of you can hear me? Water pools around my feet, singing, you. But who? So, so this also just became suddenly the ocean speaking. Um, and then it was also speaking with a reference to this prayer, which is called the Unatana Tokef, and it's the prayer that we say, oh yeah, the page. It is, oh, like what it looks like. Um, so actually, yeah, that's a good point. The poem moves like the waves, the way that the lines and the words are kind of spread across the page. So it definitely kind of mimics that act of the waves. Um, and this Unatonic Tokef prayer is about every year on Yom Kippur, we're praying so that we get to be written into the book of life because God is judging everybody supposedly. And if you make it into the book of life, you get another year of life. And so this idea here is um, there's a list in the poem or in the original prayer of how, the many ways that one could not survive the next year. And so this kind of got woven uh, into the voice of the poem. So I'll read one more for this little section here, and then I will offer another prompt. This one. Okay, this is called Goat. I also have to say it's my mom's favorite poem in the book. Um, so if she was here, she'd be clapping. She's come to a lot of my other readings. Um, and this is it's a narrative poem that was based on a very real experience. I was at a writing residency in Washington State at Willapa Bay, and next door to the writing residency, there was a little goat farm. And so I had a little encounter with a goat that I will tell you about in this poem. Goat. Each generation is named in alphabetical order, Jerry says, and the kids that rush to greet me are the F's. Francis, French fry, fantasy, Frank. Mother Darcy appears, quieter than the rest, her face stoic and knowing. Eon, with the one horn, leaps at the gate, teeth crunching on something. His landscape consists of goats, hay, horse, human, and he's chosen me, of all things, bearer of nothing but body and gaze. I look into one of his eyes, and it's washed with a light green kindness, so pure I'm broken open. I ask Jerry, why one horn? He explains, we made a mistake. We burned off the first, and the other we couldn't get right. Why do you burn off the horns? I ask. Safety. A scared buck can be aggressive. Does it hurt? I ask. And with a gentleness nearly equal to the goat's, Jerry says, yes, but within half an hour, it's like it never happened. Because of the horn, Eon would make an unsuitable pet, so he'll be sold at auction. What do people buy them for? I ask. Dinner, says Jerry. I touch the stump on Eon's head, gnarled as a tree root. I scratch Eon's ear, his neck, the side of his face. The goat's eyes flutter. The way he looks at me is a grace I can't stand. He leans his head back in an unbroken angle of bliss. I turn and he bleats at my back. Jerry repeats, we made a mistake. We didn't do it right. I absorb his confession, but I don't know what to do with it. So this is just, I thought this was an interesting poem also because when thinking of like the Jewish poems in the book, I didn't think that this was at all Jewish until my mom's rabbi at her synagogue said to me, oh, this is a really Jewish poem. It's about the confession in Yom Kippur. And I was just like, oh, right. Yeah, you're right. Like I didn't mean that, but that's true. Because Yom Kippur is a day where we confess our sins and ask to be forgiven. And so I just didn't even make that connection. And then there's also sort of like the scapegoat is a story from the Torah that's also related to Yom Kippur, and that you put the sins on the scapegoat and the goat goes away. Carrying off the sins of the people. And so it was just really interesting to look back at that afterwards and say, oh yeah, no, that's right. I didn't realize that. Um, and so there are many animal poems in the book, and I thought I would just offer, again, you can use prompt time to do whatever you want, and if there was something else that spoke to you, but um, maybe you've had a recent animal encounter of some sort, any kind, and the experience of being with the animal. I have other poems where the animal, it's not the animal is like the speaker of the poem, but it's a little bit from the perspective of the animal. So feel free to play with, it could be a narrative poem, but it could also be like maybe the poem is written in the voice of that animal. So I will set the timer again for 5 minutes. Okay, time is up. Please feel free to keep writing. Um, I want to have time to hear from you all too. So I think I'll just read maybe one more poem and then we can open it up to folks sharing some of the things they've written, some Q&A. That sounds good to people? Um, so I will read this poem, How to Pray While the World Burns. Go outside, find a patch of grass, sand, dirt. Sit, kneel, place a hand or just a finger to the soft earth. Feel it pulse back. Open your palms and divine the words creased between. Rub the specks of dirt between your fingers. See how they cling to skin, how they listen in their soft, rough way. The earth will hold you better than God can. God could not stop the bullets or the sale of weapons. God could not block the open synagogue doors. Our God is trapped in the poisoned grass where the blood of our brothers cries out, where the ants heave sentries on their backs. Pray to the God who sharpened the tiger's teeth, who stored the roar in its throat. Pray to the God who gave you lungs and tongue to sing and groan and hum. I swear to you, when the leaf shivers in the wind, you have given it chills from all its listening. The earth hears your prayer. There is nowhere for God to hide. Get down on your knees and let this precious earth soften for the weight of you. You are held. You are heard. The wind pulls its blanket over your back, smooths the hair from your face, touches your cheek with its cool, trembling hands. And I just want to say something about that poem and then we can open it up. But I wrote that, I think it was actually the day of the Tree of Life synagogue attack in Pittsburgh. And, and it again sort of took me into this space, this interesting theological space where I started to contemplate like what is God's role in these things and sort of moving from the God of, sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition, I guess, and into this more God in the earth kind of a space. And but I also wanted to just give also a shout out to a Jewish thinker that I've really become obsessed with, who Anne knows because she took the classes with me, Eddie Hillesum. Um, and Eddie Hillesum was a Dutch Jewish writer during the Holocaust, and we have her diaries and letters, and I'm a big fan of hers. And, she kind of came to this space of, I think, a similar kind of theology. And, she came to know, kind of her version of God that we see throughout her diaries. But she also comes to this understanding as things get worse during her time that God was not going to save us and she still believed in God anyway, which I thought was amazing. And so I just have a quote from her that kind of spoke to me in response to the poem. She says, "Alas, there doesn't seem to be much you yourself can do about our circumstances." She's talking to God, about our lives. "Neither do I hold you responsible. You cannot help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last." Um, and so I just think it's this really amazing concept that, you know, thinking of God as not intervening in the horrible things that happen in the world, but that there's still a place that we can create for whatever that means to us, and that helps us to find a way to make sense of and to respond to the things that are happening in the world. So anyway, that's my spiel. I would love to hear from anybody, whether you have questions or if you want to share a little something that came out of the prompts. Happy to hear from anybody.
First of all, before anyone shares, I just want to say it it feels as if you have been to every single alignment session we've ever had. Everything you're sharing and saying just aligns perfectly with everything that we do in this space. It's really beautiful. I mean, I could feel that reading your poetry, but hearing you talk about it even more so. So grateful for this. And I just wanted to say a really lovely connection that we heard recently from J.P. Newell, who is a Celtic theologian, writes a lot of beautiful books about Celtic theology and traditions. And he has a chapter in his new book is called The Great Search, about Eti. And just talking about this woman who was just before her time in so many ways. And it's so lovely to see that connection through Eddie from this Celtic Christian writer and from your work as well. I think that's another way in which we feel alignment so powerfully. But thank you for this, and eager to hear from the rest of you your thoughts or sharing what you would like. Please feel free to unmute.
Yeah, I tend to think of these things as a personality thing and not, I mean, I can't explain, because he went to some kind of a Sunday school church growing up, and he rejected it pretty quickly, yeah, as a teenager. He was just like, no, this is not true, and then just went off on his own. And yet I was so drawn to so much of the imagery, and there was just something about it that spoke to an inner question and an inner, and it was both an intellectual question but also like a psychological and emotional need for meaning, and for needing to know, needing to have like a framework that really made sense. And so it was both like theological and philosophical for me, because I probably would have been happy to find some sort of philosophical system that didn't have God in it, but that made sense of the world. And, but it was just, the more I study, the more it was like, no, there isn't one system, there isn't one right answer to this. But you can kind of see, and I just love studying these, texts from all kinds of traditions, because you can see that grasping for it, and in all kinds of religious texts, the grasping for metaphor and for, you know, systems that where like, okay, then there's like this spiritual world where this thing exists and this thing, and it's like you see these like imaginative universes, but they're created by people who are trying to make sense of things. And so I love that. And as a writer and a creator, I love that, because I find that empowering, that I, or that we can create that meaning for ourselves. And it doesn't have to be that somebody got the right answer and then told us all it was the truth. Like, I just don't believe that. Um, and whereas just someone like my husband, he doesn't have that thing, or maybe it expresses itself in other ways, but he does have a lot of respect for what we don't know as a scientist, for sure, because he's working really hard on a lot of research and different things in biochemistry, but like he's very aware of how much we can't know or don't know, as humans. But I think he's also driven by that need to know as well. So I love that question. Also, I will say, this didn't really work, but I did sort of somewhat try to experiment to see if my kids would come up with the idea of God on their own. So I mean, it's very hard to, because imagine if you just didn't, raise kids with just, you didn't tell them anything about this idea of God. So would they come up with it on their own? And it was so hard to keep it away. So I sort of, and it wasn't fully a conscious choice, but I was just like, maybe I'm not going to impose this on them. Let's just see what happens. And I just didn't mention God, like even if we said prayer, like we said blessings and things like for Shabbat, but like I didn't say that you're talking to God. I didn't say that there was a God. And I kind of just waited and waited, and they really didn't come up with it, but eventually that idea came from somewhere, whether it was somebody said it in school or wherever we were. or if I had to eventually be like, okay, now you're old enough to understand what this blessing is. Eventually I had to be like, okay, well, we're talking to this thing called God. Um, and then they just engaged with that idea. But I didn't see them coming up with it on their own. So it's just interesting to do that experiment. But yeah.
In this space of alignment, we have this kind of balance between not needing to define God at all and also defining the divine in a million different ways and from all different traditions, upholding each tradition and the beauty of it as well. So I think that's one of the really fascinating and wonderful things about this space. If we are at time here, I just want to give a huge thank you to Hila for sharing all of this with us. This has been such a delight. And I want to say to you all, you are welcome in this space at any time. Sunday evenings, our monthly author talks. This Saturday, we will be meeting to have conversation with people across different countries about this, those who are watching the recording in other countries. And also, I just want to say we have a beautiful project coming up that starts on December 1st called the Calendar of Light. And every day there is a practice, a poem, a chant, some type of contemplative practice from someone from a different tradition each day of the month of December. It is called the Calendar of Light. You can find that on our website as well. And Hila is one of the dear people who is offering as a day for the Calendar of Light. So I hope you will look for that as well. So thank you to you all for being here. We hope to see you again. And Hila, we hope that you will stay with alignment and visit us again. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. This was so meaningful, and I'm so excited to learn about this community and follow you guys and join again. This is really amazing. Thank you.
We're grateful. Thank you all.